Hey there, it is Only in America, and I'm Ali Nirani. On this week's show, communications expert and fellow podcast host Doug Hattaway tells me that people yearn for unity in these divisive times.
We heard a real yearning for unity. Most people do not like the divisiveness. I think the divisiveness in the political conversation reflects the most partisan of us, right? People like the fight and see the other side as a threat. And that's all legit, I get it. But most people actually aren't like that and are upset by that and don't want to live that way.
Meanwhile, according to a poll released this week, the majority of Americans do not want a wall built along the border. But is that enough to push the president toward compromise?
And no one knows what the president is willing to sign, where he is willing to compromise, if at all.
And we take a look at the most unbelievable story in golf, the journey of an undocumented immigrant from Mexico to the PGA.
So his first paycheck was $380, and he sent every dollar back. Didn't keep 1 cent for himself. You know, it was literally the difference between his siblings going to bed hungry or having food on the table. So he was so proud to send the money back. And
from the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Nirani with Only in America. Before getting to Washington, D.C. to join the National Immigration Forum, I worked in Massachusetts for about 10 years. Now, he doesn't know this, but one of the people I always wanted to meet was Doug Hattaway. As I saw him work for governors, presidential candidates, issue campaigns, I thought to myself, you know what? That guy knows what he's doing. Well, we never met while we were both in Boston. But a few years ago, a mutual friend introduced us, and I've thoroughly enjoyed every conversation since then. Doug is CEO of the strategic communications firm Hattaway Communications, which works with clients in politics, government, advocacy, philanthropy, and business on research, strategy, and branding. A few years ago, Hattaway Communications partnered with the Ford Foundation to form American Aspirations. Their team talks to people from all walks of life, all across America, exploring their aspirations for their lives, communities, and country. They share research insights, produce content, and design tools that can help organizations communicate in new ways, transcend social and political divides, and connect a cause to hopes and values that really matter to people. This week's episode is more of a conversation than an interview, meaning Doug quizzed me as much as I questioned him, so he's actually posting it to his podcast this week as well. Our discussion reflected people's aspirations, fears, and hopes. I spoke about the findings from the forum's living room conversations and our Out of Many One report. Doug told me that through American Aspirations research, they found common ground on what it means to be an American. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
So tell us about the living room conversations. What was their purpose? Where did you go? Who did you talk to?
Well, I mean, a lot of this kind of came from conversations you and I had probably the end of last year as you were starting to think about the American Aspirations project. For us, it led me to realize that, sure, we've been doing work in conservative and moderate parts of the country, but we were not really sitting down in an intentional way after the 2016 election to just, again, not just test, but really kind of listen to people. We wanted to do a learning campaign over the course of really the first 2 quarters of 2018. And what we did is that we went to about 26 different rural and suburban communities and really tried to sit down with folks and ask the question of, okay, what does it mean to be an American? What are your fears and aspirations when it comes to immigration? And then ultimately, how do you think that this conversation should play out? And it was a really interesting process because, strangely enough, it was very useful. We partnered with More in Common, the shop out of the United Kingdom. It's been doing a lot of interesting research. And it was useful because people were very honest with us, right? We did them in living rooms. It was a very kind of comfortable environment. You know, we didn't call them convenings. We didn't call them meetings. We called them
groups.
Right, focus groups even worse, right? And it was an interesting process because we got a lot out of it.
So paint a picture for us. Bring us into a living room. Who's there? What did you talk about?
So the first one that I moderated was in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, right? So you fly into Spokane, right? You stay the night in Spokane. You drive 30 minutes east across the state line into Coeur d'Alene, which is just this gorgeous community. It's got this beautiful lake. It's partly a tourist community now, but historically it has pretty rural population, part of the state that's easily more socially conservative than probably most parts of the country. And we end up in a living room of a church leader that we'd gotten to know. And in the room, as I remember, were a handful of folks, leadership from the evangelical community locally, the principal of a local school, a couple of business leaders, a couple other folks from the education community. And it was interesting because some people came in with deep-seated feelings for legal immigration, against illegal immigration. Others were part of the conversation because they kind of wanted to learn more. And each conversation was about an hour, hour and a half, kind of walking through this discussion guide. And what we learned was that this question of American identity is coursing through the electorate. Fears around security, economy, culture come up in different ways in different communities. But ultimately, there's a sense that, okay, there's a common set of American values, but they're also really localized. And that the person in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, they see themselves as an American, but not in the same way as the person in Corpus Christi does. So I don't know. I mean, does that match with kind of what you all saw?
Yeah, in American Aspirations, we similarly had conversations with people all across the country from all walks of life. We did bring them to a focus group center and recorded everything. And
that's so sterile and boring.
Right,
but you probably pay them, right?
Yeah. And every word gets recorded and goes into a database that linguists analyze. Within 2 weeks of the 2016 election, we were in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is one of those areas that went for Trump and surprised a lot of people and was sort of that part of that narrow win that he had in the Midwest. And we got people in the room who didn't know it, but didn't know how each other had voted, but they had voted for Trump, Clinton, and Jill Stein. And started not by asking them who they voted for, but what are your aspirations and concerns about your community here? And a lot of them said similar things about the kind of community they wanted to live in and their concerns. And it was only through the conversation they started to realize, they had different takes on the politics, right? But they were able to keep it focused on those common concerns and aspirations they had for their community versus the country as a whole. Right? So there's this national narrative, left against right, blue against red, et cetera, which they were all part of in one way. But when they were talking about their own community, what they wanted for it, there was a ton of common ground. So that was one distinction we saw. And the other was, to your point, people will say things like, America means equal opportunity for everybody. And that means different things depending on your position. And we've been looking at common ground language around big ideas like that.
The Coeur d'Alene conversation was very different from, for example, at least of the handful that I moderated was Corpus Christi. Corpus is obviously right on the water in South Texas. The demographics of Corpus are interesting because it's 60% Hispanic, but I want to say only 10 or 15% foreign-born. So it's a very diverse city, but it's also a city that is kind of a long-term native-born community in Texas, and it's politically pretty conservative. Our organizers recruited a couple people from a Republican county commissioner event the night before. So this is easily the most politically diverse group, both politically conservative. And in the room was a really good representation of the city. There's probably like 40% of the room was Hispanic, a couple of folks who were African American. The balance was Anglo. And there was one gentleman there who I remember talking to in the coffee before, and it was clear he was there with a really clear opinion on immigration. He was not a fan of undocumented immigrants. And over the course of the conversation, all these questions around security and border. So I think I asked them the question, okay, what's the immigration system you'd like to see? And this particular gentleman had the best perspective because he had realized that in this conversation, his fears and anxieties were being heard, as were his kind of aspirations for Corpus. And he says, I'd like to see an immigration system that's tough but fair. Okay, we can work with that.
Yeah.
Right? And those are the kinds of things that kind of kept coming out in all these different conversations.
And in that context, what's tough and what's fair?
It was driven by and large, the tough part was driven by and large by crime, or the perception of crime.
Yeah.
Right? Which I think we see over and over again in different polling. Fair was both fairness to the taxpayer in terms of the burdens. There's also an element of wanting to be fair to the migrant so that people could actually access a process, whether to enter legally or to be able to even legalize their status. So the tough part was always, shouldn't say always, more times than not around public safety or security. Kind of the fairness to the American as well as to the immigrant.
Yeah. That's interesting. You had mentioned in your report, which was called Out of Many One, that the political polling suggests broad agreement on immigration policy, quote unquote, and asks if that's true, why does our immigration debate seem so fractious? What was your take on that?
Yeah. I think oftentimes when we write these reports and we kind of look at the polling, we look at it from a national perspective, right? So nationally, we see a consensus, right? When you see, kind of take the full block of voters and say 60% of Republicans want the DREAM Act or whatever the number is today, right? But then when you localize that to people's particular realities on the ground, these questions will come up of, is there a public safety threat? Is the American way of life being lost? Is the economy going to thrive or be hurt by immigration? So I think that 60-70% consensus that we always point to is challenged at the local level by these fears. And as advocates, I think we have to do a better job of localizing our work so that those fears are acknowledged in our conversations and they're seen and reflected in the national conversation. I just feel like in the national conversation, we tend to assume a lot of things as opposed to life being really complicated at a local level.
Right. I know in our work, we take an aspirational approach. We try to understand people's aspirations for their lives, for their community, for the country, and connect causes to that so that we're really connecting with what really motivates people, what they really care about. And when we test messages and poll and so forth, we'll ask these aspirational questions and get really promising results. People saying, yeah, that is my aspiration. But when you get down to reality, they are still facing anxieties.
Right.
And you have to overcome those anxieties to get to the aspiration. We did work with a coalition of Muslim organizations that felt under assault for good reasons, in the political conversation and the culture. And there are those, whipping up fear of Muslims, right? While on one hand, when we're talking to people who had mixed emotions or internal conflicts about that. And they would aspire to not judge people based on their religion or what they look like, and to be welcoming of new immigrants and to value people's contributions to the country. So yes, and those were authentic aspirations. Right. And at the same time, they hear about terrorism or they don't know anything about Islam. And those anxieties are actively whipped up. And you have to address the anxiety before you can get to the aspiration, because fear is an emotional response that blocks out the other stuff.
So as you're doing the work, looking across issues, is there anything that surprised you? Or you're like, wow, this is completely unexpected?
Yeah, sort of overall in terms of all the common ground that we found on lots of different ideas about the country. So for American Aspirations, it was a little different. You were talking to folks about immigration. Right. And we were talking about America, the country, right? And it's amazing how people, they have ideas in their head about what that means, what it means to be an American. And we heard a real yearning for unity. And the data like More in Common, who you mentioned, who we're going to interview on our podcast as well, found a lot of yearning for unity in the country. Most people do not like the divisiveness. I think the divisiveness in the political conversation reflects the most partisan of us, right? People like the fight and see the other side as a threat. And that's all legit, I get it. But most people actually aren't like that and are upset by that and don't want to live that way. So that's one. And I think the opportunity is for leaders of organizations and political parties, whatever, who actually genuinely can unify people. But then specifically, we started exploring people's ideas on things like what we are calling cultural narratives, ideas about the country that are so common in the culture that they sound like common sense. Like everybody in America has equal opportunity, you just have to work hard. For a lot of people, that's not their experience. And our clients and colleagues who are working to help address inequities in society need an alternative narrative to address that. I wanted to share some with you because we tested a couple dozen sort of high-level ideas like that about America, and we were surprised at the results. Let me see if you're surprised about some of these. So here we tested them head-to-head. One statement, and imagine getting this on your phone, and you open it up and you see these two statements, and you're just asked to pick one. That's called an intuitive response survey, right? We just want to know what's your gut reaction to these two things. One, everyone has equal opportunity in America if they work hard, versus opportunity is not equal in America, even for people who work hard. Many people still face barriers because of their race, gender, or where they were born. Any guess on how that might play out, percentage-wise in the population?
60-40?
60 being?
60 on the latter.
That opportunity isn't equal. Yeah, we have 54% on that and 32% everybody has equal opportunity. Yeah. So upwards of 20 points difference.
Yeah.
and about 14% saying neither, they didn't know.
Yeah.
So by that factor, you have people, it's not a controversial statement to say opportunity isn't equal. We saw the same thing in looking at the language people use to talk about these ideas. And people from across the political spectrum said, yeah, it depends on where you're born, depends on where you come from. How you start out in life was the way most people understood the differences in opportunity that people have. So right there we have a common ground idea and common ground language to talk about it that isn't politically fraught or partisan in and of itself.
I've been doing some reading on how conservative evangelical America looks at the civil rights movement and racism. And so I saw that first statement as kind of one of personal responsibility, right? And the second being kind of the more systemic, right?
Yeah.
The system is the issue. And it feels like the personal responsibility perspective is politically more conservative, right? And I feel like that is a big part of the political debate, this personal responsibility versus kind of the role of the system or the role of government.
Yeah.
And that's not new, obviously. But it does feel like in this environment, things are a little bit like the eggs have been scrambled. And, when we look at the 2020 election, I don't feel like Democrats are speaking to aspiration. They're not speaking to personal responsibility. They're speaking to, okay, this is what this administration is doing to make the system even worse.
Right.
Right. And I'm stuck of kind of how do you make the case to elected officials of kind of, okay, it's okay to be aspirational about this stuff because you're just kind of falling into a trap here.
Yeah, I agree in terms of the politics or any leader who's looking to lead people forward is to show that vision of the positive vision of the future, not just focus on the mistakes of your opponent. And that's putting my political hat on and thinking about, if I were, a candidate running against Trump, I wouldn't try to out Trump and be all negative when the bigger opportunity is yearning for unity in the country and being solutions oriented. That's what's different in this political climate, not just being the opposite, of who's in power, whether it's Trump or anybody else. And on that note of individual responsibility, we have found in this work with American Aspirations, sure, people aspire to stand on their own 2 feet and believe in individual responsibility. That is an aspiration, and 8 out of 10 Americans say, yeah, I want to live in a country where people take responsibility for themselves. At the same time, 8 out of 10 also said, I want to live in a country where people look out for each other.
These are not mutually exclusive.
These are not mutually exclusive. What you hear individual responsibility in the political dialogue all the time, usually with a preachy tone wagging their finger at you, right? And you hear very little about social responsibility. And we found that in our conversations with people about these big ideas. Everybody in our focus groups could right off the top of their head talk about individual responsibility. They hear it all the time. And then when we asked about social responsibility, it was crickets. And the difference there is what is common in the culture. What are people hearing, particularly in the political conversation? But I'm going to try another one out on you, another message we tested in this category, kind of like there's the individual part of things and there's the system. And I think our political culture and dialogue is sort of hyper-individualistic.
Right.
And the system, the infrastructure, the stuff we all do together is kind of invisible to people. So here's another one. Statement 1, if you're willing to work hard, you can make it in America. Statement 2, it takes more than our individual hard work to succeed. We all need tools like education, healthcare, and a job that pays enough. So the old, all you got to do is work hard. Well, yeah, but you need these other things too, which are provided by the system, education and healthcare, et cetera. And policy enables those things. It's not just luck. Any guess on how that one?
I'm going to go 50-50. I'm stuck.
It was the same number as the last one. 54% saying, you need these tools. That's part of what opportunity makes it real and not just a buzzword or a slogan, is how I see it, versus 34. So again, 20-point difference, a significantly larger number of people intuitively agreeing that, you need these tools, and those tools are provided by the taxes we pay, we contribute to that, and the people we elect and the policies we enact all have something to do with whether everybody has good education, healthcare, and a job that pays enough.
So what we often found in kind of the living room conversations was that in terms of local institutions, it was the church that people saw as a place where they could connect with others of kind of more diverse backgrounds. There's often conversation about local government and the role of local government. There was a distrust of the federal government.
Yeah, it's funny because it sounds very familiar to the old saw from public opinion research that people hate the federal government, but they love their congressperson, right? And we've seen that a ton of times where the national narrative is very much alive in people's minds. You can't get away from it. But it's about this myth of the swamp, and perceptions of your local institutions and government and people there are much more grounded in reality. Mm-hmm. And there's a big dichotomy there.
Right.
And people are usually satisfied with the public servants they know, and the rest, are all going to hell in a handbasket.
It's like why they believe their local television news anchor.
Right.
And people,
yeah.
They feel like they know that person.
Yeah, it's what's around you is what matters.
Right.
But it's funny how the national narrative looms large, so large in the media and in people's minds. There's a huge disconnect. And I think it's the national narrative and the national politics is what's causing a lot of the division and angst. And people see solutions happening locally, certainly when they don't see Washington as capable of accomplishing anything. And we asked people, because one thing we did hear across the political spectrum from people from all walks of life, the system's broken, quote unquote. So we did whole conversations. What do you mean by the system? How do you know it's broken? It was interesting, defining it was broken as, well, look, the schools don't have what they need, to educate the kids, and people are without health care. They were talking about these tools not being there for people, interestingly, was evidence that the system wasn't working. And needs to be broken and blown up was usually referring to the national level versus examples of people in the local community. And it usually started with volunteering, not civic engagement like going to your city council meeting or that sort of thing. People's minds first went to volunteering in their local community as a way they can help make a difference, and said it was up to us as individuals within our communities to change the system. Mm-hmm. So again, always bring it back to the local sphere, because that's where you feel empowered to do anything.
So in the immigration context, what should we be doing differently to speak to people's aspirations?
Interesting, because you guys are really great at that. Why not?
Thank you.
Because, from my perspective as somebody who's not an expert on the topic, but knowing that immigrants to this country are hardworking people who contribute a lot to make this country work, and that most Americans, certainly that I've heard from in the vast amount of research we've done for American Aspirations and other projects, respect that. Respect people who are trying to make a better life for their family and are willing to work hard to do it, and to treat other people with respect and to see dignity in other people. Those are American aspirations. And my lesson in it, I guess, comes from working with the marriage equality movement, actually. And I had an opportunity to take a whole month working on a book about aspirational communication and digging into the experience of the marriage equality movement, which we worked with for about 10 years, and speak to Evan Wolfson, head of Freedom to Marry, who is a real sort of architect of the strategy in the movement. And he said, ultimately what happened was not just getting straight people who are literally voting on this issue, you remember, to have empathy for same-sex couples who want to get married. It went beyond that. It helped them live up to their higher aspirations for the kind of people they wanted to be. Because when you look at, like the folks coming to your living room conversations you described, had mixed emotions, or they were conflicted, to use the term we used in the marriage movement, or the psychologists would say they had cognitive dissonance, conflicting ideas, conflicting values, conflicting emotions. That's what it means to be human.
Right.
So you've got people who respect the dignity of other people, honor honest hard work, can relate to wanting to make a better life for your family, and actually aspiring to be an American citizen. That's all worthy stuff, with being concerned about somebody breaking the law, that sort of thing. So it's telling the stories that and providing people opportunities to understand, to empathize with immigrants, which I don't think is hard, actually. That's not hard.
Right.
And what opportunities for them to speak out or take action that resolve this conflict in favor of, I'm going to be somebody who, in a divisive environment like this, where fear is being whipped up, to step up, speak my values, my truth about this, which is I'm going to respect the dignity of people, look for solutions to make things work, not demonize people. And they did a whole line of work in the marriage movement, helping people resolve that internal conflict and advertising and conversations with people that they called the journey, how to help people on that journey. And what the social science says, that's called elaboration, meaning thinking about it, which results in durable attitude change. Meaning the people who have that conversation and resolve on their own terms that they're going to stand up for fairness here, they're not going to be talked out of that. They're not going to be influenced by the next tweet that's supposed to get, rile up their fears, or the next hot button political ad that's supposed to make them angry.
But it's also they're going to feel more confident talking about immigration, this example, with their friends and family.
Totally.
So I feel like, I think one of the big takeaways, whether it's from the conversations or just from the work over the last few years, is that if I'm trying to convince you based on policy, I'm not going to win.
Yep.
If I'm going to invite you into a conversation about immigration around a common set of values and beliefs that people should be treated with dignity, we can have that conversation back and forth. You can have a complicated conversation that moves the needle based on that sort of invitation. So I've been trying to think about the difference between convincing or persuading and inviting.
Yeah.
I think for us it's a subtle but important distinction. It's a different mindset.
Totally. I think so entirely. Because you're talking about conversations that start with not, here's one side says this, one side says that, who do you agree with?
Right.
Similar back to the marriage movement, when we were working on that issue in Massachusetts, the first state to allow same-sex marriage, we didn't start that way. We started, instead of saying, one side says, this about gay marriage, one side says that, who do you agree with? You're immediately starting within the partisan political context. And that right there invokes sort of the partisan response. Like, oh, I'm a Democrat, and I know the Democrats are supposed to think that, so I'll just say that, right? Versus marriage. What's your aspiration? That's a totally different conversation. Right. Most people say, well, it's a commitment you make, aspirationally for your lifetime, preferably to somebody you love, right?
Preferably.
Start there, and you have a different conversation about these couples who also have that aspiration, but are denied the marriage license. And you get to the policy via a real conversation where people think about their own perspective on this, versus this image we have of sending out messages and people just agree with them and you think you've changed something. I think these messages that I was sharing with you, to me, are seeds of a conversation.
But this is also kind of the difference between that 60 or 70% approval for the DREAM Act and kind of actual reality and the conflict that people have.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things going on, right? Like, they'll agree with the DREAM Act,
right,
for whatever reason, the way that you've described it in the survey, that sort of thing. And then it depends on what team they're on, right? And how partisan they might be. What we run up against is when people's political identity is operative. So I'm a Republican. I'm supposed to be for, against illegal immigration, I know how I'm supposed to think about this. That's a lot of what happens. So your task in this particular case is to get people to step out of that political identity and think about it in their own terms, maybe in relation to thinking about it as a parent. What would you do for your kids if you were in a country in Central America where you couldn't feed them and they were under constant threat of violence? What would you do? And put them in the role of parent versus role of partisan.
Yep.
That's part of looking at the social identity dynamics and getting people to look at it through a new lens.
In the context of the immigration debate, doing those conversations in parts of the country that are really struggling with this issue is where you start to get the politician to understand, okay, there's something going on here. Otherwise, we can do a lot of these things in San Francisco, but the politicians in San Francisco, they're not the ones we're trying to move.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. Well, that was a lot.
Yeah, so I got one more question for you.
Yeah.
So since, I know this is a hybrid episode here, but my last question for every guest is to finish this sentence. Only in America, ...
Only in America. Only in America can you really get people together who really have very different life experiences, whether it's within this country or other countries, to sit at a table and feel like they are part of something out of many one, to your point. I've been to upwards of 50 countries, and you do see that. But I think it is unique to this country that we have this aspiration, this ideal, that we can and should be doing that. And that makes me, part of what makes me happy and proud to be an American when we do that and do that well. My question for you, which we end our podcast on, is to think about an innovation or a trend in communications, technology, advocacy, whatever, writ large, that you're keeping an eye on, or you think would suggest people keep an eye on?
I think, and I was a skeptic of this for a long time, I think how people are using video is really interesting. I think that, the way that videos are also combining text so you can see the picture and the words at the same time, you just see those tactics becoming more and more effective over the last couple of years. And I think that, because like for me, I like the words, right?
Yeah.
I'm not a huge fan of like watching a video. But if I can get both at the same time, there's something there. That's one thing I keep an eye on.
Yeah, totally. Well, great. It's been great talking with you, comparing notes.
Doug Hattaway is the president and CEO of Hattaway Communications, based in Washington, D.C. There's more about Doug at our website, immigrationforum.org, where you can also subscribe to Only in America.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the James Irvine Foundation, expanding opportunity for the people of California, and from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, established in 1911 by Andrew Carnegie to promote the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding.
Thanks for listening to Only in America. I'm Ali Noorani. Our current federal government shutdown, now entering its fourth week, has earned the dubious distinction of being the longest in U.S. history. And at this point, no one sees a way out. Over the weekend, South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham emerged from the partisan noise with a fairly reasonable solution. He urged President Trump to reopen the government for 3 weeks to negotiate with Democrats over border wall funding.
I would urge him to open up the government for a short period of time, like 3 weeks, before he pulls the plug, see if we can get a deal. If we can at the end of 3 weeks, all bets are off. See if he can do it by himself through the emergency powers. That's my recommendation.
The president responded with a big no thanks. I may not be terribly optimistic about ending the shutdown, but I am optimistic Congressman Steve King's racist antics may be coming to an end. Last week, Representative King, a Republican congressman from Iowa, told the New York Times that he questioned why the terms white nationalist and white supremacist had become offensive. Casey Hunt of NBC News followed up with him.
How could you not understand that that was offensive?
No, what I was really talking about was the continuation of applying labels onto people as freely as they are. I reject white nationalism. I reject white supremacy. It's not part of any of my ideology, and I reject anyone who carries that ideology.
So why'd you say it?
That was in the context of a long interview with the New York Times.
In a written statement, King said, quote, "Under any fair political definition, I am simply a nationalist." But he did not say he was misquoted.
Did the Times misquote you?
I don't think I can answer that clearly, but I'll just say I have responded to this, and I think you understand where I stand.
Instead of ignoring King's racist comments as they have previously, congressional Republicans denounced his statements, and House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy said on Face the Nation that he would address it with Representative King.
That language has no place in America. That is not the America I know, and it's most definitely not the party of Lincoln.
Should he be punished for it?
I have a scheduled meeting with him on Monday, and I will tell you this. Action will be taken. I'm having a serious conversation with Congressman Steve King on his future and role in this Republican Party.
What does that mean?
Because as a leader, there is a number of things you'll see that has taken place. But I will not stand back as a leader of this party, believing in this nation that all are created equal, that stands or continues to stand and have any role with us.
In fact, just this morning, news broke that Congressman King was stripped of his committee assignments. Kudos to Republican leadership for standing up. Finally, something fun. For Golf.com, Alan Shipnuck profiled 37-year-old PGA Tour rookie Jose de Jesus Rodriguez. Jose de Jesus grew up as the second oldest of 7 in the Mexican village of Irapuato. Taking on the responsibility to earn an income for the family, Jose de Jesus dropped out of school at age 12 and started caddying at the Santa Margarita Golf Club, a 20-minute bike ride from his home. A few years later, Jose de Jesus illegally crossed the Rio Grande River, made his way to Arkansas, and began life in America as an undocumented immigrant, working to find his American dream and to send money back home.
The vast majority of his paycheck was going back home, and so I went to the family homestead in Irapuato, and they had torn down this little shanty that the family lived in, and they thanks to the money that Jose sent home, they built two pretty sturdy 2-story houses with kitchens and bathrooms. And beyond just the physical circumstances, I mean, he really did change the trajectory of his family. Like his younger brother, Danny, instead of having to drop out of school and work, he got to continue his education, and now he has a law degree. And so just the sacrifice of one teenager completely changed the circumstances of his family. And now his kids, they're already talking about which American colleges they want to go to, and his daughter wants to be an engineer, and his son wants to be in computer science. And it's really incredible how one person can make such a dramatic change for all those around him.
To make a long, unlikely, incredibly inspirational story short, Jose de Jesus, known as El Camarón, returned to his hometown at age 25, is now a dues-paying member at Santa Margarita, and is working his way up the PGA Tour. To quote Alan's article, El Camarón's story is certainly the most unbelievable story in golf. So take a minute to look it up on golf.com and, well, hit him straight. That's all for this edition of Only in America. The show is produced by Regina Medina, Emily Chow, and Joanna Taylor. Kathleen Farrell is the executive producer. Thanks for listening. I'm Ali Nurani.